What is stuff? What is matter? What is everything? Well, it turns out people have been asking that question for a long time. Have you ever thought about something like this? What if you had a piece of paper? Could you tear it apart forever and ever and ever? Or would you eventually get to an item or a particle that you could not tear apart? Well, it turns out philosophers, or people who think about the world, have been thinking about that for an awfully long time, at least 2,500 years or so. For example, Aristotle, who was a teacher of Democritus, had thought about this question, and they came up with different answers to the same question. Aristotle thought one thing, and Democritus thought something else. I had students take notes in their journal, and so if you want, you can add the notes I'm giving to your journal, and then you will add that to a foldable I'm having you make as well. Well, let's take a look at the difference between the two philosophers. Again, they lived about 2,500 years ago, and Aristotle was the teacher, and Democritus was the student. What did Aristotle think? He thought you could forever break things apart, and they would just get smaller and smaller and smaller. But you would still have the same item. So it might be helpful to understand kind of what he thought things were made out of. So he thought everything was essentially composed of earth, wind, fire, and water, and he called those elements. So to give you an example, let's say you had a real fire. What would fire be? Fire would be basically 100% fire, 0% water, 0% wind, 0% earth, and that would be fire. Well, what about coffee? It might be 25% earth, 25% wind, 25% fire, 25% water, and that would be coffee. In paper, you would just have different ratios of things, 40% earth, 20% wind, 10% fire, 30% water, and that would be paper. I just made these numbers up to illustrate how he might think of it. Furthermore, if you tore the paper apart that I proposed in the first question, you would always keep those ratios the same and just end up with smaller and smaller pieces of paper. He was incredibly popular, and again, he lived around 2,500 years ago. What about Democritus? Well, Democritus was a student, but he had a different idea. He thought if you took a piece of paper, you'd eventually get to a piece that you couldn't break apart. So, for example, try this thought experiment. He thought everything was made of particles, and so I represented particles with the black dots. And let's say that's a piece of paper. He thought you could never tear through a black particle, but you would always tear around them. So let's say we tore the paper in half, and here's my half paper over here. So you had 6 particles here, and now I have 6 here. And so you'd have a smaller piece of paper. And then if you tore it in half again, or in this case not quite in half, you'd end up with one piece that had 4 particles and another piece that had 2 particles. And I just drew the piece that had 2. And let's say you tore it in half again, it would tear around those particles. It wouldn't tear through them, and you'd end up with just a single particle. And that would be unbreakable, he thought. And he called that atomos, Greek word atomos, which means unbreakable. And yes, that's where we get our current name atom. And so it turns out that he was actually closer to what we think matter is like today. Not exactly right, but he was much closer in those terms than Aristotle was. Here's just a summary of the two ideas side by side. You could always pause this video if you needed to and take notes in your journal. When we finished, what you're going to do is you're going to work on your foldable. You can work on the cover sheet. If you take this first tab and we divide it in thirds, I had students summarize the marble activity we did the other day, and then the notes you just took were over Aristotle and Democritus, and you can work on that tab.